the real story when it comes to like responsible business practices for us, the real story is being honest with our consumers about things, educating our consumers about things, particularly consumer behavior. That is the way to make change, in my opinion. What we buy says a lot about who we are and what we value.
My name is Jeremy Kirkland, and this is Blammo. My guest this week is Brendon Babenzien, founder of Noah and former creative director of Supreme. And since recording this, the new J. Crew Men's creative director. Jeez, is that enough? Legend. Brendon and I chat about growing up in the suburbs of New York in the 1970s, the massive music scene of the era, and getting into skateboarding at a young age. Most importantly, Brendon lets us in on what he thinks a brand should be, and how he's trying to create a legacy while still operating responsibly, with human rights and the environment informing his decision-making. Plus, we get his take on how Noah is trying to educate consumers to want less. This is one of the most enlightening conversations we've had this season with the real source of menswear and fashion. Let's dive in. It's interesting because I think Noah obviously is a clothing brand and you guys make fantastic clothes. Your taste is next level. It's beautiful. I mean, the stores are incredible, but Noah to me, and I think to a lot of other people, I have friends that work at Nike, I have friends that work at Patagonia. Noah's become the new sort of like what a brand should be, in the sense that you're a company that's run with convictions. You're a company that is very transparent in how you want to do your business. But a lot of these things, it feels like you're not trying to sell me a piece of clothing from Noah. You're more trying to communicate a larger ideal. And like, it feels like for you guys to be successful is actually more of a legacy than just selling an individual piece of clothing.
I mean, I would say that's a pretty good assessment. But I would also say to your friends at these other companies that they might not agree once they find out just how hard it is to do what we do. They might change their minds about, whether or not we should be the model going forward, because it's incredibly difficult to try and have just have a business, right? Run a business that essentially has given itself some major guardrails in how it behaves. Mm-hmm. Because really you limit your possibilities, right? I'll give you like the simplest example. We don't make polar fleece anything. Like we would probably sell it incredibly well if we had like polar fleece products, right? Right. But we don't make anything because, they just like, it's a polyester material and like sheds incredibly in the wash, like zillions of microplastics every washing and this and that. So we just don't do it. We almost don't use any polyester at all. Like occasionally there's some products that are blends, like a cotton nylon blend, but we tend to use them on things that you don't really wash. So you're dealing with the kind of like microplastics issue. So like we have these massive limitations. I mean, we won't make disposable plastic accessories. So if we make an accessory, it's not like one of these really inexpensive things that you can sell thousands of because they're like $5, because we just think that's wasteful, right? It's another thing you don't really need. So like you could do Bic lighters all day, right?
Yeah.
Sell thousands of them and make money on them. Like you'd make a good margin, right? But like,
oh, absolutely.
But they're Bic lighters and they're plastic and they end up, being thrown out and in the street and everything else. So we make Zippos, which can last a lifetime or longer, but they're more expensive. So we sell a lot less of them, right? Like all of these little choices, they mean a lot, And it's not that we don't make anything in plastic, but if we make something in plastic, it's something that you use over and over and over. It's not just like a disposable product. It has to be something that you genuinely would use for a long time. So it's hard. It's hard doing what we do. And it definitely is a bigger story than just like, we want to sell you clothes for sure. Like when we started the business, it was, the idea was to build a business that could prove that you could be successful in business and still act responsibly.
Mm.
You know, and it's not an environmental conversation. Everyone thinks it's always about the environment for us. It is, because that falls under the larger umbrella of trying to operate responsibly. But there are other things too, right? Like human rights issues, and you know, there's a lot of different things going on there. But environment falls within that scope, so that's part of what we do, and that's, I would say, the thing we have the furthest to go on. Right? We have to figure that out, and we're learning as we go, and we're trying to improve every year in you know, how can we make products that have less of an impact. But the real story when it comes to like responsible business practices for us, the real story is being honest with our consumers about things, educating our consumers about things, particularly consumer behavior. That is the way to make change, in my opinion. What we buy says a lot about who we are and what we value. So if we continue to buy things at this crazy clip, right? I need this, I need that, I need this, I need that, I need this, I need that. And like, we just rifle through things, then the business environment will not change. They will keep supplying you with those things you're demanding, right? But if you change your behavior as a consumer and stop buying certain things, then the businesses will have to respond to that. Businesses will not continue to make something the public doesn't want.
True. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So they just won't. It's death. So it's just, you know, it's science. Like, they cannot continue to make a product nobody wants. So they'll change. So really, you know, in that way, that's where our strength lies more than anything. I think we stop demanding these things. You know, we stop buying the plastic water bottles or drink bottles or whatever. We stop buying cheaper clothing and things like that. That part is the one we get hung up on. Cheaper clothing, right? Because most people can't afford really well-made clothes in beautiful cloths, right? Or like not even beautiful cloths, just durable cloths, right? Forget about beautiful, right. Like just like good quality, right? It's expensive. So that part is really fascinating because it's kind of like you have to reshift an entire society's idea of what success looks like and what life is supposed to be like. Because right now, everyone has been convinced through advertising and marketing and, you know, all, you know, just the way we live, that the more you have, kind of the better your life is, right? Yeah. So it's not enough to have like the one or two really good shoes, right? Because maybe the ones you have aren't the latest and the greatest, and you're just trying to like survive socially, right? Like you're just trying to like fit in and be cool and have the girls like you when you're 18. And so, and like sometimes what you have maybe isn't enough, right? But if there's a shift in mentality and the latest and the greatest is no longer the thing that gets you attention or kind of satisfaction or other people respecting you, then we can change the kind of consumer hole we've gotten ourselves into, right? So like if the kid who has less but has better style is cooler than the kid who just shows up in the latest sneaker that's reselling for whatever, then, you know, that kid becomes, you know, more the center of where our value structure lies. And then we can move that direction, right? Yeah. And that's kind of where we come in, because we do recognize that not everybody can afford a bunch of expensive clothes. But does it make sense to buy a whole bunch of cheap clothes that you're not going to have next year? Like, you know, I know the economics of it is hard for people to understand, but like buying a lot of cheap stuff when you have the money to buy that cheap stuff over time costs you more than buying less good stuff. Yeah. Just economically, that's how it works out, right? You buy cheap stuff, it breaks down or you throw it out or you stop wearing it or whatever. And over time, you're spending more money, right? So The problem we have is there is no option for poorer people right now in America or probably anywhere to kind of like, I guess what I'm trying to say, it takes tremendous strength to rise above all of this.
Yeah. I mean,
Tremendous strength. You're alone, you know?
and it's a constant battle too, because even I was talking with a friend of mine and I was ripping on H&M and I was like, dude, H&M is just like they're the biggest polluter in the world. They're awful. And he was like, look, it's fine. He's like, but you also have to understand that some of these brands like H&M and Gap and Old Navy, when like clothes for the mass became more affordable, you had an empowering of people who didn't have as much money,
Right.
and have, he's like, you had like a democratization of what someone's personal image was, because this person wore that Gap thing, and guess what? There's tons of them available and everyone can look like that person, right. Which is a couple issues. One, it's like kill your idols. But on the other hand, you also have like, okay, that's fair. You're right. That's a good point. And if all clothes were priced in the way, this is a fine line for me to walk, but if all clothes were priced in the way that they should be, obviously this wonderful utopian society, and then because then you get into bigger things like, well, if people were paid more of a fair wage, then they could buy the clothes that, actually cost the right money.
The system as it currently exists will not allow responsible companies to succeed at a mass level, right? It says there's simply not enough people who can afford to pay for the products that are produced in a more responsible way because they're expensive. So it's a smaller audience, right? Like, there's a few reasons for that. One is economic inequality, right? Poorer people can't afford to buy better quality things, so the demand for less expensive products goes up. Cost of living, which is what you're addressing, right, continues to go up, but the pay doesn't match the cost of living, right? So people are being paid less in a society that costs more to live in, right? So like, you just don't have, it doesn't add up, right? The consumer can't activate their power to demand better products to make change because they can't afford to.
Right.
Right. So, and then on the other side, you have the manufacturers, right? They have to respond to higher demand for cheaper goods. And in other cases are simply looking to increase their own profits. So some can't change and some don't want to change, right? The result of this is manufacturers either seeking cheaper labor and ways to cut costs, which results in even more poverty and rule breaking, such as dodging safe human rights and environmental practices, right? So it's the system that we're in. It's the bigger system that, I can sit here and be like, yeah, you should just buy better stuff. No big deal. And it's like, yeah, tell that to somebody who's just struggling to pay their rent and put food on the table. I recognize that is not a real option for everybody. What I'm trying to get to is a place where we have more of a wave of people who understand how this works, and we slowly start to change our behavior as consumers to make it change, to make it better, right? And it has to happen at multiple levels. There's consumer behavior, there's, legislation that needs to happen. I mean,
yeah,
this country is absurd to me that there's people sitting there being like, oh, you can't help people. They got to put on their boots and get it done. And it's so ridiculous that there's people who still talk that way when the system is clearly rigged. It's clearly unfair and uneven. I mean, it's bonkers to me. So,
yeah.
But as it relates to just clothing, people have, in order for this to start to change, either the system has to provide people with better options, or we have to change our view, how we gain our self-esteem, right? Because a lot of people tie their self-esteem to what they own, to what they wear, to what they drive, to where they live, and all these things. So we would have to change that completely. And that's a lot to ask of a 16-year-old kid or a 13-year-old kid or a 24-year-old kid. Hey man, everybody's doing this. And if you show up wearing this or driving this, everyone's going to think you're the greatest. Don't do that. Right? That's what we're asking. Yeah. And that's really hard to do. So, as it relates to Noah specifically, we recognize that puts a massive limitation on the business. And you accept that. you say that that's not our role is not to be the biggest. Our role is to kind of like provide a space for people who want to change, and want to be a part of the change, to buy clothing and be a part of something, right? And we could have come in and made only really, really, really expensive stuff, and some of it is, I would argue not as expensive as it would be if another brand was doing it, but expensive, no doubt. But we recognize that, and this was another kind of industry norm we challenged, that you could be multi-price point at the same time, right? Most brands, they exist, that they're high, they're middle, they're low. I mean, they even talk about it that way, right? Like, we're a middle tier brand, and we're, and we challenged that. We said, well, we got beanies for $32. T-shirts are 48. They're not the cheapest T-shirts in the world, but they're pretty average at this point. And then we have $1,500 cashmere shirts, all in the same space. And that was really important as well, because why should you have to buy, call it like a spin-off brand or a sub brand or whatever to access something? Why does it have to be, well, here's the brand, and then, oh, we have this other thing and it's called something else. And then we have this other thing and it's called something else. Because then you're not really getting the thing. You're not getting the actual thing, right? You're not a part of the actual thing. You're part of something else.
Well, that's why, at least to me, I think and hopefully this doesn't offend you. I think Noah is a movement more than a clothing brand. When you look at everything that you guys are communicating, it's never so much even on your site, all your marketing, all your messaging, you as a person, there's never anything that's like, buy this to feel better. It's a message, but you also sell clothes.
Right. I mean, I would, you might be giving it a little more credit than it deserves, but I mean, I would love for that to be the case. I mean, because the fact is, and this gets into another area of conversation when you talk about authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been someone who thought you shouldn't really mess with stuff if it's not really a part of your, if I was going to all of a sudden do I don't know, a collection inspired by rowing, right? Without a partnership, right? I would have to go learn to row. I would have to be a part of that culture and community in a real way, right?
Right.
To feel really good about it, or at least, another approach we take is, if there's someone in the organization who's genuinely connected to something, that becomes a part of the bigger story, because the brand isn't singular. It's not me. It's not myself and Estelle. It's the people that come into the community and what they bring as well. So we've been lucky because we have a lot of really fascinating and interesting people working in the company who bring a lot to the table, but the idea of activity, things that people are passionate about. I'm talking about the movement comment now.
Yeah.
When people are passionate about something, that's when it becomes real. That's when the brand is real and not like a created lifestyle, right? That's when you haven't sat down with agencies and this and that and cultivated and curated this idea of who you are. It's no, we do and touch the things we do and touch, right? We skate, we surf, we run, we've got bird watchers on the staff. We've got, people who care about the environment on the staff. We've got, everyone loves music. So everything we do is really real. And I've often said that activity, brands that are based in activity, they're more authentic than brands that are based in some other weird idea, right? Like fashion brands, right?
Right.
Because people are passionate about their activities. It doesn't matter if it's skateboarding, surfing, running, fishing, tennis. It does not matter. That's you're into it. That's really who you are. I play tennis. I love tennis. Great. Tennis brands have a much more loyal audience than any other brand, right? Because, or fishing brands or skateboard brands, because people love what they do. So we recognized that early on, and not as a marketing trick, but just like, how do we communicate to people that what's important to us is the things you do and the things you're interested in, and that gives rise to your style. It's not the other way around. Just like shopping isn't a thing. Like I mean, I guess it can be, but it's pretty scary if that's like your hobby, right? If that's your passion, right? Like, and shopping doesn't necessarily lead to good style. Shopping leads to maybe being in fashion. They're very different things, right? Like being fashionable is just having the latest thing that everybody agrees is cool. And usually they agree it's cool because they paid celebrities $1 zillion to wear it, either in the streets or in an ad or whatever. So then you're influenced by them. You're not coming to that conclusion on your own, right? So
Yeah.
we kind of like built that into the business. We're like, we're just going to do the things we do and, make sure activity is part of the conversation, the things we're really interested in doing. Because that's where style comes from. Like real style, not fashion. It comes from, like, if you're a skateboard kid, you're influenced by all of the things that come with skateboarding. And with skateboarding, it's a mixed bag. It's all over. It's like really diverse, right? It's fascinating, not just stylistically, but musically, and the personalities, and like the fact that it's not like one race, and it's like you're just getting this like great kind of like mix up, and you take from it what you want. But you can kind of see skateboarders, like oh, that's your culture, and it is a real culture. Same with, like, I talk about hip hop early on, when there wasn't a massive industry building clothing for like the hip hop community. It wasn't like targeting, right? It was more like it was invented out of thin air. It was like, I'm a b-boy, I rap, my friend's a writer, my other friend's a dancer, like this is what we do. And like, this is how we dress. But in the early days, the dress style was just an amalgamation of things, right? It was like pulling things. It was like regular sportswear from like Adidas and Puma and Fila and those brands, mixed with like, a sheepskin or, a fur trimmed like hooded bomber. Like these were all things that were taken from other places, lumberjack shirts, BVDs, like, they all came from other areas and then were like appropriated and reinvented. And that just shows real creativity, right? That just shows a community that really is independent and has real creativity. And it wasn't until many years later that people recognized, like, oh, we can like target this audience and build brands for them, right? And then it became this really kind of like, I would argue, generic look.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like it became really like singular, because like, in the early days, like the late 70s and the early 80s, when I was a kid, everyone didn't look exactly the same. There was a lot of things like, creased lees and fat laces and stuff like that. But within that, there was a lot of nuance. You know what I mean? Some of it was based on what you can afford. You know what I mean? Like, some people, if you were like a breakdancer, like you went a little more the sportswear way. You know what I mean? And like, maybe if you were just somebody who like really appreciated everything that was going on, but you didn't participate in the same way, you weren't like a writer, or you weren't, a breakdancer, or, a rapper, or whatever it was, or DJ, like you might've just had like a fresh style, right? And like, maybe you had more money. So like you had some of the more elevated pieces, like for me, like a sheepskin, that was like the top tier.
I mean, that was
right. Like if you could afford a sheepskin, then like, you were really flexing, because we were all kids, right? Like talking about like 12 years old, 11 years old, 13 years old, like this, you're young. So yeah, it's pretty interesting how those two communities for me, skateboarding and hip hop, I think contributed the most to like at least creative thinking about clothing. And, and I think it has to do with the personalities of the people, at least in the early days, connected to them. They were just more independent.
Yeah, and punk too. I mean, my friends and I always make a joke that like anyone that was into punk eventually like became like a clothing designer or a creative director. I mean, it just happened, you know. I mean, Aaron Levine and I text about this stuff all the time,
Right.
to where it's just like punk rock dudes, you know, Brian from Wooden Sleepers, you know, guys that used to be in bands, they're all into clothes. And, you know, I mean, Jeremy Dean,
Right.
you know, I mean, that's, you know, and I don't know if it's like an anti-establishment. I don't know, you know, what it is, but there is this, and maybe it's kind of like what you're saying, because I don't think all of those folks have the same background, or, you know, they had a love of music, but everything was kind of an amalgamation outside of that.
Well, I think, you know, I think a lot of it is time and place, right? So where are you from and when are you from there, right? So I was from the suburbs of New York, where starting in the 70s, maybe around 6 or 8, definitely by 10, I was already on my way to being not the typical teenager, right? So my interest in music very young was not normal. I think I might have been 6 or 8 when I started listening to like real deal grown up music. Like, you know.
Who introduced you to it?
So I don't know if anyone introduced me to it. My father wasn't really around. I think some of his records got maybe left behind. I honestly don't remember how it happened, but like I was listening, so I can vividly remember listening, and this is not music that people will really think is very interesting today necessarily. But for a 6-year-old to be listening to this stuff at that time, it was kind of like I was listening to Jim Croce and
Hell yeah.
and Kansas. You know, I remember listening with my cousins to Toys in the Attic by Aerosmith, you know, really young. I think I might have been 8 when I was listening to the White Album by the Beatles. So like, and I don't know how that happened. I honestly don't know how that happened. Like it just, maybe it was just trying to connect, you know, to my father who wasn't there and there's his music. I don't really know exactly how it happened.
Right.
You know, some of my cousins were older. I mean, they're not even my real cousins. We called them my cousins because we lived with them for a little while anyway, it was a whole divorce thing and we were living with other people. And some of them were older and I think it was their music too. So that's what introduced me to that. And then, you know, at that age, even Queen. I remember I was listening to Queen really young, which was pretty much the popular music at the time, but it was rock and roll, you know? So for a 6 and 8-year-old to be listening to that was a little bit off, and then that interest in music expanded. And I think I just had an interest in music generally, where I think at the time, most people felt they had to choose. It was like, you know, by the time you're 12 or 13, you know, your older brother is going to dictate to you, you know, what you're listening to. So, oh yeah, you know who else? One of my oldest friends, the guy whose wife just texted me about his 50th, Garrett Fig, he had an older brother and an older sister, and they were a fair amount older than him.
Okay.
So I would go to his house all the time. I'd say this is 3rd grade, 4th grade. His brother had Ramones records. He had Genesis records, and that might have been his sister's records. I'm not even sure whose were whose, but we would listen to these records. The Police. So we were getting this musical education very early on and not really fully understanding it, just letting it to like wash over us. You know what I mean?
That's awesome. I mean, it's music and scent are the 2 strongest like memory triggers.
Yeah.
Like if I hear Stuart Copeland just beating the shit out of some drums on a Police album or whatever, that reminds me of like, you know, North County and then my cousin's house and then this and then the way the food smelled there and their house and the color of the walls. Like only music is able to do that sort of thing for people. I mean, that's why there's also like music therapy, right? I mean, but that really hits.
I mean, if I track it all, which I don't think I've ever really done. So it started there. Then if you fast forward a couple of years, I'm a little bit older. Now I have an older brother as well. He and his friends who really, you know, I had already been skateboarding from like 1976, but they were obviously influencing me tremendously because they were older than me, right? They
Right.
were listening to like In Excess, right? This is probably like 81, 82, like when In
This
Excess,
is all like just absolute banger albums,
right?
by the way.
But this is like when In Excess first came to the American market. Like they were early on it, right? And so I was hearing that, loved it. But I talked about time and place earlier, and I say that because if you're a suburban kid in New York, where you're interested in music and things related to music or things that share culture with music. So if you're like into skateboarding, you're going to hear certain things, I had so much exposure in such a crammed window of time. You're talking about like from the 70s music, which evolved into like, you had punk, post-punk, new wave, like doom, 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 right? All of that I was being exposed to. And then simultaneously, I had cousins from upstate New York in Newburgh who were exposing me to hip hop as it was happening. Like it wasn't discovered later. They were coming to visit in the summer, or I was going to visit them, and I was hearing hip hop as it was being released. Like I was super young. I didn't really make much of it, but then that really got me interested in like hip hop and like b-boy culture and that kind of stuff. And it was all happening at the same time. Then you get into like teenage years. There's a radio station that was on Long Island called WLIR, which was the premier alternative music station in the country. Like K-Rock gets a lot of credit, but most people don't know WLIR because it went out of business years ago. So it's just been forgotten about. But it was absolutely the premier alternative station in the country when nobody would play that music. They broke every artist from the UK, no doubt about it. I mean, U2 gives them credit for breaking them. Like it's,
Oh, wow.
Yeah. If you go on, like satellite radio now, like First Wave, Larry the Duck was a WLIR DJ. Like all these DJs that are on like all over like satellite radio, a lot of them, Malibu Sue, like they were all WLIR DJs. They were kids. They were like in their 20s. And I was exposed to that station, as were a lot of Long Islanders. You'll find that if you look at people in their like 40s and 50s and 60s from Long Island, a lot of them are like new wave fans because of this station. You couldn't even get it in the city. The bandwidth wasn't, or whatever you call it, wasn't strong enough to get it in the city. Like, so we had this like crazy education from this radio station. And if you were someone who didn't fit in, if you felt like you weren't the football player and all that kind of typical stuff from the 80s, this kind of was your place. So as a kid who was into skating and surfing and different things, that music really appealed to me. I mean, I remember the first time I heard the Smiths, I just could not believe there was someone out there who felt the same way as me and put it into song in such a way,
Yeah.
Or The Cure, or, I mean, it just was like, and I really got pulled into that world in a major way where, and not to say it was even like the music is deserving of the attention, right? Like Sinead O'Connor's an incredible artist, right? Imagine a 15-year-old kid in, a high school that Boomer Esiason went to, because he went to imagine the culture there, right? In the 80s, like football and baseball were king. And here I come, 15 years old, and I think Sinead O'Connor is like the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, right? Like that's not normal, like that's definitely not normal, So I say that to explain like time and place. I was in New York, and not so much just the city, but like I was exposed to so many different things in such a brief window of time. I'd say all the way up to the late 80s, very early 90s, when kind of like rave stuff even came over to America from England. We were really interested in that music. We were already listening to, there was like kind of like like Ministry kind of like evolved into like industrial, right? And like bands like Meat Beat Manifesto. So like, and we were also had this history with dance through hip hop. So, dancing wasn't a problem for me and some of my friends. Like we knew how to dance. We were really about it. So, from hip hop, house music into kind of even like rave stuff, some of the rave stuff that wasn't like hardcore stuff.
Mm.
had a lot of soul to it and had a lot of kind of like house influence. So I'd say from like 75 all the way to like 1992, it was just another new musical thing after another.
Yeah.
And if you loved music, it was just so rich. There was so much newness. And like each one of these things had its own culture you could kind of like explore, right? Like going to shows was one thing, right? But then going to Nell's, for hip hop and, R&B or whatever you want to call it is a whole other thing. And then going to a 50-person party in a recording studio is some whole other thing. Culturally, you get all this really interesting stuff happening. The thing they share is a love of music, right? All the people there have a love of the music. And I think I've always appreciated that. And there's a movie that came out recently called Shoplifters of the World.
Mm.
It's not the greatest movie, but it's also not the worst movie. It's about the day the Smiths broke up. And it's just these friends in Denver, Colorado, who are Smiths fans who don't necessarily fit in, right, with the rest of society.
Oh, okay.
And it's a day in the life of these friends. And then this other guy who works in a record store who goes to the radio station and takes the overnight metal DJ hostage and forces him to play
Airheads. I said Airheads.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like that, right? It's like takes the DJ hostage and forces him to play the Smiths. And of course, by the end of the night, they realize how much they have in common, right? Like, and how much the music even has in common. And for whatever it's worth, the movie's worth watching just for that.
Oh, damn. Okay.
Like I'm still trying to get my wife to watch it, to get her to like get some context on like where I came from and how I ended up the way I am. But I would recommend it, especially if you're a Smiths fan, because there's like 20 Smith songs in it. It's hard to stay immersed in emerging culture as you get older, right? It's just like life takes over. And I often wish young people would kind of like know that sooner, like acknowledge that reality. So they kind of like, one, really cherish the time they have when things are happening, when you can just get on your skateboard, go out, be out all day. You don't know where you're going to end up. You don't know what you're doing.
No responsibility.
Loads of people like really appreciate that and enjoy it. But also, I think, have a little respect for older people who maintain an ability to kind of be open-minded to new things, because I don't think people realize just how hard that is to do when you get older. Just how hard it is to kind of like stay, or even want to stay connected to new ideas and new things. It's incredibly difficult. Like no one around you is doing it or trying to do it. You've got family, you've got kids, you've got responsibilities, you've got all of these things. So like, you don't even have the time. So you have to make time.
Right.
You really genuinely, if I want to know what's going on in music, I've got to make time for that.
Yeah.
It doesn't occur naturally for me anymore. And it won't for anyone who, like these kids today who are 22 and 23, they're going to be in the same boat as me eventually, So like the sooner they recognize that that's a reality almost for everybody, kind of the better off they'll be, because they can prepare for it and they can like build infrastructure in their life for it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's actually some of the stuff you do really well with a lot of the collaborations that Noah does, in which, like you guys did a collaboration with The Cure, you did a thing with New Order. You have this upcoming thing with Tom Wesselman, or the estate of Wesselman. Like, how do some of those things fall on your plate? Or is it you being like, I love The Cure, let's find a way to do something with The Cure?
I mean, the music ones are usually just come directly from my heart. It's like most of the time, that's how they come about. I'm trying to think if there's been any recommendations from other people that, I mean, everyone in the company appreciates the things we do already. So like people can throw out all these ideas and they'll eventually happen. You know what I mean? So like, but the music stuff, a lot of it comes from me. the brand stuff, it could come from anywhere, but like, it's always stuff that we're interested in. It's always stuff that we're generally interested in. Music specifically, that is more for me trying to make sure that we don't lose the thread of connection from where we are musically today, going like, so people have a
Right.
history, right? Like there's a lot of things that are happening today in music that wouldn't have happened without all these other people, right? All of these other bands that came before them. And I think the musicians understand that. I think that the bands, right? They grew up listening to bands, they've been influenced by them. But I don't know if the public necessarily understands that. So we try to kind of position these things as kind of educational tools. Like you should really know about this. And by the way, the stuff looks great too. You know what I mean? Like, and that's a big deal because, going back to Supreme with the music collaborations we would do there, like obviously the graphic element is massively important.
Right.
So if you have an incredible band and they have no graphic history of any kind, it makes it a lot harder to do, right? If you really want to do it, it becomes pretty difficult. But if their graphic history is really rich, then it becomes that much easier. Like think about like Black Sabbath and things like that. There's really cool stuff there to kind of like dig into, and in some cases, it's recognizing that some bands, for whatever reason in their history, didn't necessarily tap even their great graphic history in a way that they could have. So you kind of come in with a design sensibility of like, oh, you have all these great graphics from your singles that nobody ever saw. Let's put one over here. Or like, let's screen grab video shots if we're legally allowed to, and put that on a t-shirt. So it's just a different idea, right? Because the bands, some of them never really thought about their products. It just wasn't what they did, right? Somebody else did it for them and just turned up. So it gives us an opportunity to kind of like reimagine some of what they could have done, which is super fun for us.
What about like the art estates, like with
the art
Wesselman?
Stuff, so the art stuff, full disclosure, right? Like art for me personally, I used to think I didn't know anything about art and I didn't care about art. That's how I used to think. Like I was like, I didn't have time for it, I didn't have money for it. I thought there was a lot of kind of like, I don't know, I thought it was kind of like out of my zone. You know what I mean? But since starting the company, since starting Noah, I've kind of shifted my perception a little bit where like, I do have a real interest. What I don't have an interest in is a lot of the stuff that comes with it.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And I realized when I was younger, I was avoiding that. I was avoiding the kind of like social construct. I was avoiding the kind of like all the stuff that came with being interested in art, like the conversations you had to have, the places you had to go, maybe people you interacted with. That stuff didn't interest me at all. But artists and art, I discovered more recently in later life, I'm terribly interested in that because it's people expressing themselves, and it's really independent thinkers in a lot of situations, right? People trying to do their own thing, actively trying to do their own thing, right? Like a great artist might be influenced by other great artists, but has no interest in copying them, right? And like, so it's kind of a new beginning for me, to be quite honest, over the last several years, like what interests me. And when something really genuinely hits me, it makes sense to potentially talk about that in the same way we talk about the music stuff. So that's where that stuff is coming from now. It's kind of new and fresh, and in a way very exciting for me because I don't have an art history. I never cared. I never really, like, I was surrounded by it. Like I couldn't walk 10 feet without being hit in the face with like, hey, you coming to this show? Or like, hey, have you met this artist? Or like, it was always there. It was ever present around me, but I never really engaged. I just kind of kept my distance. It always felt like I wasn't sophisticated enough for it or something. So I just kind of was like, I'll stay away from that. But now I just feel like, I guess when you get older, you just don't care anymore about that stuff. It's like, well, I like what I like.
Yeah.
And if I find it interesting, we're going to talk about it. And Wesselman falls into that category where, looking at the work, I could tell you a little bit about Wesselman as an artist because once I saw it, I started exploring the history, but I'm not like an authority of any kind. I just really loved it. And I did get even more engaged when I discovered that, Wesselman came to his style or styles through rejection of his influences,
Mm.
which I love that. Like that's kind of how new things happen, right? So yeah, I've discovered, and to people who care about art, I'm like nothing, right? I'm like silly, but like I did discover there's things I like, and I started, really thinking about what we could do with it, or what it means to me, or should other people, and I'm not a sophisticated art person, right? Like what I like usually just tends to look good. Like
Yeah, same.
visually it's interesting. Like I'm
Yeah.
not, I do lack sophistication in that way. I'm just like, well, if it looks good, I like it. I mean, I like David Hockney. You know what I mean? How it's like the easiest thing in the world to like. You know what I mean? Like I'm not out here trying to kind of like talk to people about my sophisticated knowledge of art in any way, shape, or form. However, I think Wesselman is incredible. I love the work that he did. I love the approach he took. There's a lot there that I'm really interested in. So it seemed like a really good fit for us. I think it was probably recommended even from it might have been one of the team that first kind of like talked to me about it. You know what I mean?
Oh, that's awesome.
Like, yeah, I'm not even sure that one came from me. It could have, honestly, like I forget what happens sometimes. It could have been me seeing something like, like having an interest, we should do this, but it could have just as easily come from Amir or Corey or one of the guys that I work with.
I mean, that says a lot about how you run your business, just as an aside. The fact that, not everything that is outputted by you all comes from you individually, I think is huge in terms of team empowerment. And
yeah, it definitely does. And I mean, everyone brings stuff to the table for sure, which, is I think what gives us kind of like a rich kind of culture and presentation as a business.
yeah.
Yeah, and I just don't remember how the Wesselman thing came to be, but I'm really happy about this idea that art is finding a place in my life, and I'm really happy about the idea that I didn't feel forced into it to be interesting or cool.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I feel really, because now it feels really honest and genuine for me. Like the things I like, and it took me a long time to get here, and it had nothing to do with social status or of any kind. It just kind of like slowly evolved, and now I feel confident. Just like, yeah, I like that. And if you don't like it, and you think I'm a dork for liking it, that's fine. So it's a great time for me to really explore these things. Estelle, my wife, I'd say she has a much bigger interest, or has had a much bigger interest in art over the years. That might have something to do with how I'm getting here and evolving as well, because she's really interested, and she has friends, who are artists in the art world, and so that probably plays a role, in how the direction I'm going with my relationship to art.
Yeah. I'm trying to challenge myself to buy one piece of art from like an artist that I like a year. Now, like, I'll be honest, I like some artists that make art that I will, making a living as a podcaster, I'll never be able to afford. But like someone like Jeff McFetridge, whom like I've had on the pod, super nice guy. He sells his studies. You can, email him, and the way, in terms of his art as a whole, it's extremely affordable.
Right.
And I was like, okay, it's going to hurt a bit, but I really love this. I also want to patronize, the artists that I like.
Right.
I mean, it's weird. Someone told me about like, there's a website that basically is like an art market similar to, everything else that's, different galleries and different dealers. And I guess it just surged in COVID because people were like, well, I'm going to redo my house and buy a bunch of art. But it's like, you can get, there's another woman named Clara Chabrian who, or maybe I mispronounced her first name, but like she's a Spanish artist, and you can get her studies and things for really inexpensive, and it's beautiful.
Right.
And so I'm like, okay, like I want to at least put myself in the habit, not that like I'm going to become some like snobby art collector, but just like to to try to have more of a direct relationship with the things that I really love.
Right. I mean, it's
You know?
it's really interesting. I mean, Estelle puts a lot of art in the stores.
Yeah, I was going to say, you guys do a good job with that.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, oftentimes it's friends and people we know, so that also has kind of exposed me, like Curtis Kulig is a really good friend of ours. And,
Yeah, that's amazing.
he's like right up the stairs from our store as well. He's like, our store is like a living room for him. He's like family, and yeah, she's been bringing a lot of art to the stores, which is really cool, and it's educational for me as well, because I also have to like it, right? Like,
yeah,
I don't think she would necessarily just go off on some tangent and do some stuff I really don't like, But one of the more interesting things I learned in this process of working with artists, or not working with them, but like sometimes the estates and so on and so forth, like, is I have a friend from high school I hadn't seen in a very long time, and we weren't like super close. He was like really good friends with like this kid who I hired at the shop. And so they were like a grade or two below me. They were like the up and coming kids who were into skateboarding. So they were like the outcasts in their little community. So obviously I loved them. And, I knew him then, hadn't seen him for a million years. And somehow, I can't remember how we reconnected, but like he became a still life painter. And I think that's what it's called, but like, old school, like,
yeah,
really super old school, like, and we did some stuff with him. We did a t-shirt, and he lent us a beautiful painting for the store. And in the process, you can find the thing we did with him, because we have a video with him talking about it. And I was fascinated because he will only paint in natural light, which means he has limited time in the day to paint. He has to have certain skylights in certain places and stuff to get the right light and all this kind of stuff. And it's an incredibly slow process. And I guess nobody cares about it anymore. So like the thing in art that takes arguably the most skill to do is the least respect, because like what he paints looks like photographs in some. I mean, it's just phenomenal.
Yeah.
And he has to do it with very strict kind of like guidelines in how he does it to be considered a master at what he does or whatever, right? And I find that fascinating, because I think that stuff's incredible. I love that stuff. I think it's absolutely stunning and beautiful. And it's interesting that like it doesn't carry a lot of financial value in the art marketplace. It's people just decided that's not cool. And he explained it to me. I think it was a rejection. I think with like pop art in America and that kind of thing, it was a rejection. I think this is how he explained it. It was a rejection of old European history, right? It was this modernist idea of like, that's the old way, and that made sense to me. I was like, oh yeah. So if everyone's been painting this way for hundreds of years, and you're an artist and you want to do something different, obviously you don't do that anymore, right? You're going to go to like, just painting like a canvas blue and be like, that's it, done. Like, so it does make sense. But then at the same time, it bothers me that our society is so reactionary to things that like they don't create space for all of the components, right? It's like, if you think about the early 90s, when everyone decided in skateboarding, like you couldn't have a skateboard wider than like 7.5 inches, and we had this, and that you couldn't even buy a big board for a long time.
I got ridiculed because I had like an over 8-inch, Bob Burnquist, whatever.
Right. You couldn't buy bigger wheels. You could, 60 mil, forget it. Like like it wasn't even available in the market. People stopped making it completely. And that drove me nuts. And like, it's really nice to see now that like in the skateboard world, it's really diverse, right? Like you can get shapes, you can get popsicles, you can get, wider trucks, bigger trucks, smaller wheels, bigger, like, and I feel like, I guess I'd like to see some of that in the art world, where like this space that existed for so long and takes so much time to master would get a little more respect. His name is Dale Zinkowski, and he's amazing. He's just like the coolest kid. Well, he's not a kid anymore, but yeah. So that was an interesting part of my art history discovery.
That's cool. best thing, like in a, other friend of mine who is an artist is like, just, liking art is just having an opinion.
Right.
You don't have to look at a Vermeer and be like, oh, it was so amazing because, he was so poor and he spent all his money on that blue, and but like, it doesn't matter. Like if you like it and it moves you, that's it. That's all you need. And I think that's probably some of the best stuff about art, because a lot of stuff, clothes, music, sometimes if someone says they like it, they're going to get like quizzed on it, versus like, no, I don't need to, just because I didn't understand the politics of the Smiths at the time,
right,
and I like this song. That's it. That's enough.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, so I mean, the Wesselman stuff for me was it's color, it's theme, it's
very colorful.
Yeah. Like, and that's it's the women, like the way he painted women is really cool. You know what I mean? Like the use of space and non-space is really interesting to me, and just looks really good.
Yeah.
So I'm super excited about that collaboration. Actually, like it's
Well, it's good that you're doing that too, because I feel like you have a lot of people who are very loyal and huge fans of Noah, and whatever you put out, they're going to try to understand more. I mean, Supreme was like that too. I mean, the amount of people that got into Miles Davis from a Supreme collab I think is great, actually.
I mean, look, with James, it's a whole other level. James loves art and loves artists and always has. And, we were all getting an education from James in that space. You know what I mean? And recognizing that some of the art could reach regular people through apparel. This is a really insightful thing. You know what I mean? Really smart and just cool as well. Right. Cause if you have, Damien Hirst t-shirt or whatever, or like, any of the artists, right? Like Wool or any, Marilyn Minter, go down the list of projects from over the years. I mean, visually they're all great. They all just look great. They're just incredible. You know what I mean? And like, if that's your access point, because most of us can't afford the actual art, I think that's okay. I mean, I think there's limitations. I think, I think intention really matters, right? Like what you intend to do with things should play a big role in how art and artist's work is used when it comes to anything outside of the actual work. Mm-hmm. I think you really, the estates, some of them care, some of them don't.
Yeah, I was going to say the Rothko estate is somewhat notorious, so yeah.
Like some of them are like, no way, or like, yes, but only if, and others are just like, whatever, like, no, like, and that's interesting. You wonder what would have happened in some of these cases if the artists were still around. Would they have embraced this? Because the new ones do, right? The newer artists all embrace this as just part of the new way that culture works, right? Some of them came up the same way we did, so they're kind of okay with products and things, right? Because it's like always been a part of their life. So I wonder if some of the older artists would have had that same openness to it or not. And I wouldn't judge it either way, right? Like it's their choice. Everyone has their own idea about what their work is and how it should exist, right? So there'd never be a judgment, but I would be interested to see who would line up with the current state of things and who wouldn't, if they were around,
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Especially when, you have some folks that unfortunately, left us right as, the mediums of what their art could be was getting radically expanded.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So, this is a new journey for me. I hope it continues, and I hope I don't get pulled in the wrong direction with it, and I just stay focused on what I like and not all the external stuff,
I mean, that's it right there. It's just like liking what you like. Anything else, I mean, fuck them. Honestly, it just doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, at my age, I don't, that is kind of my approach to almost everything.
Yeah.
But it's hard. It's not easy. We are like, everyone thinks you grow up and like, you kind of like leave the teenager behind and, your insecurities and all this, but you kind of don't, you know what I mean? Like you're still kind of like,
yeah,
you still have feelings, right? You're not bulletproof.
that's been the hardest thing I've dealt with maybe in the past like 2 years is this level of adulthood into which I have friends that are way, I'm not complaining, but friends that are like way wealthier than me, have zero responsibilities, are dicking around in New York, getting 10,000 iced coffees a day and like doing whatever it is that they're doing.
Right.
And like, they don't understand where it's like, no, I have a dad who's sick. I have a 3-year-old. I have like these responsibilities and I can't live that life that you're living anymore.
Right. Right.
And like mentally, I've been like, oh my God, like if I'm not in New York right now, if I'm not at that stupid fucking restaurant, like, is my worth gone? Like there's been like crazy stuff that's happened that maybe only somewhat recently in terms of like this like level, I don't know, mid-level adulthood or whatever that means when you're seeing all the friends that at one point we were all on the same level. And now I have some that are way lower,
Right.
way higher, all over the place. It's weird.
Well, I mean, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with kind of like, where do you get your value from, right? Like, I somehow at a very young age, I remember this too, acknowledged that the general idea of what's good or cool or interesting is only one way. And like, there's like a million other ways that things can be interesting or cool, or, you know what I mean? Like, so if you're cool in New York, right? And, cause you got the right clothes and you eat the right places, your girlfriend or wife or boyfriend or whatever is beautiful. And you have all the things that tick all the boxes of like what it takes to be like, man, that person's awesome.
Yeah.
That's incredible, right? And you take that same person, but all they know is that stuff, right? Like they know where to eat, they're cultured, maybe they go to the ballet and galleries and this and that. And that's the thing, right? You take that same person and you drop them in Alaska and like they can't chop wood or do anything. They're kind of like, or they're not like a prize catch there, right? Like,
yeah, good point.
If you can't fend off a bear and protect your wife and kids, you might be pretty useless in Alaska. You know what I mean? So like, it's fascinating to me that like it just depends on where you are, right? It's a matter of perspective. And if you can reshape your perspective and be like, yeah, I see all that over there right next to me is all very cool and interesting, but like, I live here. There's going to be a whole other group of people who are interested in what you're interested in and think you're an interesting person because of it.
Yeah.
And I think, to be fair to New York, I think New York allows for that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I think New York really allows for like, you can still be an active person, or you can be a literary person, or, like you can be like, a yuppie, you can be like, all of these things like can exist together in New York. And it allows those things to kind of like have their own spaces. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. First off, thank you so much for
this is fun. This is
your candor, your generosity, and I'm glad this worked out. Like you were kind of like my white whale.
Oh, really?
Like, man, well, yeah, I mean, because for me, I mean, you're, whether indirectly, I mean, you've been a huge influence on my life and my love of the industry and what you've built, the fact that you've been able to be who you are and make Noah and make it, and also like it feels like optically you haven't had to compromise on too much, and it's only made you more successful.
I mean, we don't compromise that much, but that's part of the problem, right? Like that, that's what makes it so hard to do.
Sure.
Like I often wish we could compromise a little more and make it a little bit easier on ourselves. But that's flattering. Thank you for saying that. That's really nice.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. I mean, and you have a lot of our listeners are massive Noah fans.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, like when the barber thing dropped and all that, I mean, we have this like internal Slack group of a bunch of like our like member listeners, and they all like were, buying it and going down to the store and yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, huge Noah heads.
That's cool because barbers, it's been a part of my life forever, and it's always fun to be able to like touch something where you don't change it. Like we didn't do anything. We didn't do much, right?
You elevate it. That's the cool part. Is
tiny little alteration, a fabric choice or a color choice. That's really all barber needs, right? It's such a good product that you don't have to do much to like make it like interesting again. right?
Yeah.
It's such a, yeah, it's so well done already. You just drop a little something in and it's like, okay, cool, we're good.
Yeah.
You know,
True.
show some restraint.
Well, thanks again so much. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, have a good weekend.
All right, you too. Bye. You've been listening to Blamo. Our show is produced by Blamo Media. Our associate producer is Jason Schwimmer. Maddie Franklin is in your DMs and running our socials, and Brendan Finn edits the show. Theme music, as always, by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. You can find us on Instagram at Blamo Podcast, and do us a favor, leave a review on whatever app you're listening to us on right now. If you can't stop and need all the hot content, join us on Patreon for tons of exclusive episodes, a private Slack group, merch hookups, and all the fun you can ever imagine. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a good holiday.